All right, what's going on, guys? So we are back. We have had the vehicle completely rust-proofed with the folks over at Krown here in Hamilton, actually at Stony Creek to be specific. Great location, always super accommodating, pretty quick, you know, all things considered. And it just speaks to their experience. I mean, if you check out their Google reviews, they've got a ton of amazing reviews and nearly a 5-star rating with the hundreds of reviews that they have. And like I said before, I've had a number of my vehicles done there and I have no complaints. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the process, let me explain what they do. So the first thing that, and again, probably one of the big things why people will not get this done is because in order for them to do their job effectively and for the product to work as best as possible, they do recommend drilling holes into hard to get areas in the vehicle in order for them to get the protection. And what they do is they basically put a wand in and they spray the mist of this oil lubricant and rust proofing material. So let me just kind of show you an example of some of the holes that they drill. So first and foremost, as you can see on the door, this is your typical inspection hole that is provided by Honda. This gives you access to the rear of the handle so that you can remove it. Moving downward, this is the hole that they've installed. Now, the reason they put this here is because if they try to get through this hole, they're going to be stopped by their wand is going to be stopped by the handle and the hardware. So by putting this hole in here, this allows them to put their wand down the entire length of the door and spray the rust proofing throughout that area, which inevitably is going to allow it to creep down and then make its way through the drain hole. So one thing to note is your vehicle will drip for days, but again, it's not terrible. The coating will stick on the vehicle and stick to the metal, so don't think it's just going to drip out entirely. Trust me, I thought that before, but that's not the case. The nice thing about this is that it drips its way all the way down to the seam of the door, and this is typically where you're going to get most corrosion because moisture makes its way down and then moisture will accumulate at the bottom of the door where the seam is, and that's generally where your corrosion is going to start. Moving on to the chassis. So the A-pillar here, you can see that they've put a hole just above the hinge, and then there's another hole that they've drilled down there and another hole that they've drilled over here in the B-pillar. And the reason they do this is obviously to be able to spray in this confined area that you really don't have access to. Like, I mean, short from taking the dash out and taking off all the carpeting, you're never really going to get access into the A-pillar area. And generally the rocker itself, this is completely, you know, this is a sealed unit, but again, this is where corrosion and moisture is going to accumulate inside there, especially if you live in a climate that is, you know, more, you know, that has more precipitation than others. But what I really like is that when they drill these holes, they're uniform on both sides, so it looks consistent. So again, to the untrained eye, most people, and you can see with the little, you know, seal that they put on it, most people have no idea that that's actually done through an aftermarket or through a rust proofing company. Moving to the back, we have another one here to get the lower part of the rocker, and then we've got one up here to get the upper part of the rocker. Now, it's going to get down into the, or upper part of the quarter panel, it's going to get down into these areas. And you know, Hondas of old were notorious for rotting out here in the rear quarters, and this is going to prevent that because it's basically providing a barrier or a layer to not allow moisture to accumulate. And especially with this cladding, I know for a fact this cladding, when you remove it, has clips, and it clips into the metal. And even with fresh paint and cured paint, sometimes those clips can remove some of the metal, and that could be an area of corrosion as well. Now, I'm not going to get right underneath the vehicle at this point, but I will put some B-roll in so that you can see what I'm talking about and maybe show an example of the rust proofing that was done at the dealership, which is more of that like rubberized asphalt sort of black spray. And they don't do it uniformly. It's not like the entire car is covered in that. Even when I worked in the dealerships, they just basically hit it with a gun wherever they could get an exposed area. But they're not going to remove panels. They're not going to go into the nooks and crannies of that stuff. And there's a lot of debate on, you know, online with respect to how effective that stuff actually is. Some argue that it's not effective at all. Some say it's actually worse and that rust can build behind it, like if you get a, you know, if that membrane, that seal becomes penetrated by a scratch, and then moisture and you know, salt gets behind there, it'll actually start to corrode from behind it. Now that might be the case with frames specifically, like truck frames and stuff like that, but in my experience and working on and being around Hondas that have had that sort of asphalt coating on just the sheet metal alone, I haven't seen anything like that specifically. So again, the stuff that's on there, albeit maybe not the best, it's not terrible, and I don't anticipate I'm going to have any long-term problems as a result of that. However, whatever issues may come as a result of that are going to be mitigated by just doing an annual spray with the Krown. So let's move on to the hatch. Now, one of the kind of common areas on the FK8 is you'll see guys posting right here, the body seam starts to corrode. And I don't have any sort of evidence of that at the moment, but it's kind of an area that a lot of guys like to keep their eye on. For whatever reason, there seems to be, where the body panels meet, there seems to be some corrosion that happens there. And it's been documented by a few people on the forums and online with corrosion happening there. And believe it or not, when I had my championship white FK8, it was like new, and I was already getting a little bit of what appeared to be rust staining coming from that area. So definitely something to keep an eye on. I'm hoping that when they drilled this hole here and they sprayed, it's like a mist, and I'm hoping that that mist maybe makes its way up here and maybe provide some protection. Who knows? I don't know. But nevertheless, you can see that, you know, the area there is, they also do all the hinges, which is really nice. You can, I don't know if you can tell on the camera, but they spray all the hinges. And, you know, we got a hole here. Again, you would never know that that's not dealer, you know, a dealer done or factory done hole, in my opinion. And what that's going to do is they're going to spray inside the hatch. Naturally, when the hatch is down in its closed position, you can see that they sprayed there. When the hatch is down in its closed position, all of that rust proofing oil is going to make its way down. And then again, pretty much a copy of the other side there. So hole down there, hole up here, and again, they just spray into the corner panel, giving you that protection. And then same with the passenger side. So we got a hole down there, hole over here, and right there. So we'll move on to the engine compartment next, but as you can see, guys, I mean, it's pretty undetectable. You know, unless you know what you're looking for, I would say, you know, 90% of you, if you saw this vehicle at a dealership, you know, and you didn't have another one beside it that didn't get the rust proofing done to compare back to back, you would never even know. I mean, I only know because I know what I'm looking for. And when I go looking for used vehicles or pre-owned vehicles, that's one thing that I look for to see if it has been rust proofed. I mean, because in where we live in our climate, that is kind of an important thing. And I would say for most of you, even if you live in a climate where there isn't really any road salt, it is a good idea, you know, if you live in an area that does see a lot of accumulation, that does see a lot of moisture. You know, you see some vehicles, for instance, like if you go to the UK, and I don't want to speak, or, you know, on behalf of maybe folks in the UK if you're watching, but, you know, they don't use a lot of road salt over there. As a matter of fact, their winters are generally very damp, you know, depending on the part of the UK they live in, but they have a lot of moisture. There's a lot of accumulation. It rains a lot there. They're also, you know, right at the sea and the ocean. So they see a lot of that, kind of that saltwater mist, so to speak. And, you know, you'll see cars rotted out there all the time. You know, so anyways, moving on to the engine compartment, as you can see here, you know, it is just glistening with rust proofing, which is amazing. Right back to the firewall, just covered in its entirety here, which is awesome. And even down, like you can see just on the frame rail here, the inner fenders are just completely coated. You can see it's just pooling in there. You know, so again, a great example of, you know, kind of the work that they do. You know, the hood, they go through all these little holes here and kind of get in around there. Yeah. You can see the frame rail down there. It's just glistening. You know, and that's the other thing too, is when they spray this stuff, you know, the focus isn't so much having this, you know, they're not going to necessarily get the engine, so to say. They're not going to spray the engine, but they're definitely going to make it a point of spraying it in any of the areas, like along down the firewall, the frame rails up front, because they want to make it a point of, you know, being able to protect as much as the exposed surface as possible. And the one thing I like is that you'll see that, like, you know, these forward-facing hardware that is generally getting a lot of exposure, you know, even with the seal, the trunk seal, or the hood seal, I should say, you know, you can't avoid, you know, every bit of moisture. And even just when the salt is dry, you know, that dry salt dust makes its way into the engine bay, moisture accumulates in this area, and more often than not, you know, the hardware right here is usually the hardware that's going to show the corrosion. You know, this stuff is dry. As you can see, this is not protected at all. What the hell, Krown? But anyway, you can see here, you know, here's a good example of hardware that has not been protected. Now, the vehicle's been kept relatively clean and in good shape, but you can see some, you know, some oxidizing or some sort of, you know, staining that's already starting to develop on that hardware. Whereas in right here, you know, you don't have any of that, and naturally it's going to keep all of that hardware nice and protected. You know, in these areas here, like, that's a leaf, if I can get it out, but that's a greasy leaf now. Anyway, you can see on my fingers, like, this stuff is just, it's thin, and it penetrates, and it, you know, like, as you can see, as I'm rubbing it around on my fingers here, it's actually acting as a really nice moisturizer. But you can just see how it is, and this creeps and it sticks on the metal. And again, it's all down the brake booster, as you can see there, and all along the firewall. So, I mean, one of the amazing byproducts of this product that they use is that when they spray it, it actually becomes like a mist. So even though it might not be in direct contact with the wand or the spray, indirectly this mist is kind of making its way around. So you're indirectly going to have a little bit of this mist kind of adhere to the engine block, adhere to the cylinder head, adhere to some of the hardware that is in and around the engine area, the suspension components, yada, yada, yada. And that mist in itself is going to also act as a little bit of a protection shield, but also, you know, things, moving components. For instance, you know, under the hood, the shift linkage, you know, that's a moving component that you don't necessarily have access to. It's generally a sealed component. It is lubricated from the factory, but over time and with use, you know, the lubricant runs dry. By doing stuff like this, that mist, even though it's not directly targeted, that indirect mist that does make its way in the engine compartment will lubricate things like that, will lubricate joints, will lubricate rubber components, and you know, it does a good job of that. Not in this one in particular, but in my white Type R, I noticed my shift linkage felt pretty normal. I wouldn't say that I found it or noticed a problem with it, but when I had it crowned, after driving it, it just felt smoother. And maybe that was a placebo effect, but I'm pretty convinced that the shift itself, the shift throws, everything just felt smoother. So again, it just acts as a little bit of a lubricant, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, another big question or concern that a lot of guys have naturally is, what is it going to do to areas like the seals? Specifically, you know, when we go down here, you know, the door seals. So every Krown, what they do is they actually spray these seals before they spray any of the rust proofing. They spray those seals with a silicone spray. And the silicone spray is going to act as a barrier to not allow the oil spray in itself to penetrate or to saturate that seal. but it's also going to keep that seal nice and lubricated, or keep it from drying out. And if you don't already do that to your seals, you know, owning an S2000, owning other cars, and like I had the Del Sol, you know, it's common, the roof seals and everything, you know, with the S2000, you want to lubricate it with the special Honda protectant or seal protectant or lubricant, and it's basically just a synthetic based grease that helps keep those seals nice and protected. So what they do is they spray a spray-on silicone spray, and then they spray the rust proofing. And again, I've had a number of vehicles that have been rust proof by Krown and have not had a single issue with regards to any of my rubber seals sagging or, you know, deforming whatsoever. And I know that that is also a concern for some people. So in closing, my recommendation is to strongly have your vehicle rust proofed. Maybe you don't want to do Krown, maybe you want to do, there's a new product here in Southern Ontario, there's another company called Honey Seal, and their product looks really great. It's a wax-based product. They also do dry ice blasting, so you can get the full treatment done, you can get the dry ice blasting done. And if you've watched Speed Academy at all, Dave just had his Tundra done, and that thing was a fucking rust bucket beneath, and they dry ice blasted it. They, you know, presumably painted any of the rusted areas that were really heavily corroded with, you know, rust proofing paint, and then they hit it up with the Honey Seal, and it looks like crazy better. And I contemplated about doing that to this vehicle, but the cost associated in doing that is significantly more, and I'm not saying it's not worth it. I just said to myself, you know what, I would feel more comfortable having protectant put on my vehicle on an annual basis if I continue to drive this every winter. And even if I don't, I mean, moisture is moisture, it'll get in places, but I felt more comfortable about getting protection that I would do on an annual basis that is relatively affordable. It was about $150 taxes in to have that done, and they recommend doing it annually, but I know people that have done it, you know, every other year. Some people get it done twice a year. And in my opinion, you know, I probably wouldn't go any longer than every other year. I definitely wouldn't skip, you know, I wouldn't go more than 2 years without getting it done. But I mean, the investment, the cost, it's low cost, it's relatively quick, you know, you're not leaving the vehicle for a day. And in my experience, it's done a tremendous job at keeping the vehicle in good shape. So in closing, my recommendation is, again, you know, if you're driving this vehicle in salt or in any climate that is, you know, sees a lot of, you know, accumulation of moisture, get your car rust proofed. It's just inexpensive, you know, inexpensive insurance if you want to keep it looking clean and fresh. Because I'll tell you right now, getting a body job done on one of these cars, you know, I have family in the body business, and, you know, especially nowadays, a lot of places are just collision shops. They don't want to get into redoing a car and respraying a car. It's well worth the investment. So that's my advice. See you in the next one, guys.